Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad to see so many of you here. I'm Suzanne Goldberg, Executive Vice President for University Life at Columbia University. The Office of University Life, for those of you who don't already know us, is an office that focuses on the university community as a whole. We work with students, faculty, and administrators across the university's many schools on issues of student life, intellectual life, and community citizenship. And I'm especially happy to welcome you today, to welcome you back to the new semester, and to welcome you to our first in 2016 of the Awakening Our Democracy series. As you know, today's conversation will focus on the politics of religious freedom. Awakening Our Democracy is a new signature series at Columbia we launched this past fall, and it focuses on issues of race, ethnicity, disparities, and justice, and other pressing issues of the day. And the real goal is to enable a conversation with fascinating people who I'll tell you about in a moment of major issues of the day within our university community, so across the many schools. And just to let you know, those of you in the audience today and watching on live stream are from every single school at Columbia, from the student body, from faculty, from administrators, and as well as from the surrounding community. We're really glad that you're here. In anticipation of the conversation today, we asked you to submit questions and your ideas, and I wanted to just share three. We'll cover quite a lot of ground, I'm sure, as the conversation goes on. The first is, how can we and the media contribute constructively to conversations about religious freedom? How can I be a better ally to my friends when it seems their faith is under attack? And what roles are there in this conversation for people who may not have a strong sense of faith or may not be connected to any particular religion? You'll find these questions and many more in the space that we have on the University Life website for digital conversation. It's called Ideas and Action, and I encourage you to check it out. You can find the University Life website at universitylife.columbia.edu. In that Ideas and Action space, you will also find recommended readings and even musical selections from some of our panelists, and you'll also find connections to the live streams from previous panels. We're so appreciative that the Awakening Our Democracy series has co-sponsorship from centers, institutes, and organizations and colleagues from across the university. You can find their information and more about them in your program as well as on the website. And I'm pleased now to introduce our panel for today's conversation. Patricia Sabga, our moderator, is a veteran journalist and author. She is currently the global affairs correspondent at Al Jazeera. She has reported and produced extensively from around the world for NBC, CNN, and CNBC, and has also lectured in journalism, which is particularly fitting since we're in the journalism school today. Next to Patricia is Professor Yosef Sorot. Professor Sorot teaches religion and African American studies here at Columbia and does many, many other things, including directing the Center on African American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice. He's also Associate Director of Columbia's Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life. Next to Professor Sorot is Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum. Rabbi Kleinbaum leads Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, which is New York's and really the world's largest LGBT synagogues. Newsweek has called Rabbi Kleinbaum one of the 50 most influential rabbis in the United States, and she's also my rabbi. So I'm glad that she's here. I'm glad you're all here. Next to Rabbi Kleinbaum is Imam Khalid Latif, and who serves as the university chaplain and executive director of the Islamic Center at NYU. Imam is also an New York Police Department chaplain and member of the city's task force to combat hate. Thank you very much for being here as well. We're thankful to all of you for being here, and now I will turn it over to Patricia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm so pleased to be here, and I'm so pleased to be moderating this discussion. I just want to say right off the bat that this is a complete vindication of a strong liberal arts education to promote critical thinking and important, intelligent, and thoughtful discourse on some very important issues that are critical to both our nation now and our nation's trajectory in some very perilous times indeed. So we have met the panelists, so I just want to kick things off because, of course, there are many millennials in the audience today. And I thought it was very interesting that a recent Pew survey showed that millennials are actually the least religious generation. You're the largest generation in the United States and also the least religious. Only about half of millennials identify themselves as being religious, and just over a quarter actually attend religious services. Now, what you might not also be aware of is outside the United States, I lived abroad for 10 years. And in Europe and Britain, the United States has a reputation, far from being a secular country, is seen as a deeply religious country by outsiders, very deeply religious, and that religion plays a really, really strong role in public life. And sometimes that's not always seen as a positive, because many people abroad believe that religion has also helped frame our foreign policy. I'm not saying that that is true or not true or validating that point of view. I'm just saying that this is the perception from the outside, and we do live in a globalized world. But what I want to do is take the discussion toward the compatibility of religion and democracy, and specifically with millennials. And I want to throw this open to our panel first. And first of all, I just want to get your take. I would like you to finish this sentence with your ideal next line. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation.
That's my answer. No,
What line would you put next? One nation?
to mutter and stumble without a response to one nation in relationship to one another in the world.
That's okay. You can think about your response and come back. Let's take it to you, Rabbi Kleinbaum.
Well, I would skip under God and go back to the original language of the pledge, which didn't have God in it at all, but was added in the 1950s in a response to an anti-communist energy in the country. As a rabbi, I don't think people need to pledge to God. I don't really think God cares about whether or not people pledge allegiance to God. I think God cares about how we behave in the world.
Imam?
I don't know how prudent it would be for the only Muslim on the panel to talk about how to reframe the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States, especially when there's cameras rolling.
Well, we seek to be provocative.
I'm into
and
reframing
thoughtful.
too.
I don't know. I think I can understand where the prompt and the premise comes in and appreciate it. And I think as we have an ever diversifying country, to really harness and appreciate that diversity and look to see how you can utilize foundational elements of the country, such as the Pledge of Allegiance, to be more broad-based and encompassing. I think you could find a ton of different language that would allow for those who already honor that pledge to still stay committed to it, while creating room for those who might not identify as believers to still feel as if they have a place to call this country home.
And yet, in public schools, we say one nation under God, or at least that's what we teach our children, and that is how they're indoctrinated. And thank you so much, Rabbi Kleinbaum, for giving the brief history lesson, because some of you may or may not be aware that the Pledge of Allegiance originally did not have under God in it. It was put in, it was politicized, it was a move in the 1950s. So with that in mind, and the reason I asked that first, and I'll start
I
with-
learned that as part of my undergraduate Barnard education here as a liberal arts major at Barnard in the 70s.
Yes, go liberal arts. So Imam Latif, I'll put the first question to you. So given what we know about millennials and the fact that they're the least religious generation, do you see religion playing less of a role of public life in this country going forward? And if so, is this a good or bad thing for American democracy?
Well, I would say two things. One, so I work at New York University. Please don't hold that against me, being up here. And NYU is not historically rooted in any specific faith tradition, but in the last few years has made very deliberate steps to embracing religious and spiritual diversity on campus. And a big catalyst for that was actually analysis that indicated a majority of students on campus were actually more inclined towards religion and spirituality. Simple data analysis found that, for example, the majority of events that students were hosting on campus through clubs a gross majority were in fact done by religious and spiritual groups, not inclusive of those clubs that when space couldn't be found on our campus, they were just hosting their events informally in stairwells, in the lobbies, between rooms that were available for club bookings. So I would challenge that premise a bit, because I think that there's still a large component of the millennial generation that is actually very spiritually and religiously inclined, both in the form of organized religion and spirituality as well as outside of it. And I think that being said, it would be difficult to then engage democracy in general, absent or devoid of conversations around religion and spirituality, because it assumes, I think, it has an assumption that I don't necessarily think is valid. I feel like there's a lot of people who actually are very committed to religion and spirituality in certain ways that they then bring that to their day-to-day activities beyond operating in a vacuum that informs the way they see society on a whole.
So you see the country is becoming more religious. Do you see religion playing more of a role in public life going forward?
I think religion is going to have to play more of a role because the world itself is just becoming smaller, and we're at a very unique circumstance in that I can now have a perspective of the other without having ever engaged the other. I have ideas and notions of people that I've never interacted with, and much of the time my perspectives of them are not of them in specific as individuals with names and narratives, but what my perceptions of them, inclusive of what they're bringing in terms of religion and spirituality, that I have otherized. And now, for me as a person, I start to identify my own sense of values in contrast to the them that I've constructed. And as we see in the political arena today, there's no hesitancy in invoking religion and spirituality to be able to further one's claims and one's agendas. And I think the unfortunate reality is that religion, can be utilized as a catalyst for benefit and gain, but many who we find at the forefront of many of these conversations are turning it and utilizing it into a catalyst to really further segment and divide.
But hasn't religion always been seized upon by politicians to advance a personal agenda, to grab power, to appeal to voters, to push a specific agenda? Rabbi Kleinbaum, would you like to take that one?
It's hard because we have very divergent definitions of what religion means, and I think that's a piece of what this data, differences of this data. And I agree with what the Imam is saying, that just because people are maybe not defining themselves in some of the traditional religious definitions of their parents or grandparents, it doesn't mean, I think, that this generation is less interested in the questions of meaning and purpose and origin and spiritual depth. And I think there's a fear looking around the world, and it's certainly one that I have, that religion has been hijacked by the political forces you're referring to.
Okay, so let's narrow it a little bit. Let's say for the sake of it, because let's just take spirituality, that sort of broad spiritual question thing, which everybody by their nature has, I think, therefore I am. All you philosophy majors out there. Let's put that over there. And let's say organized religion, because especially when you're talking about millennials, they don't identify, fewer of them identify with an organized religion, a major world religion, if you will. And as I said, just over a quarter attend religious services regularly. Do you see organized religion playing more or less of a role in public life?
You mean in the future or now?
In the future.
It's pretty hard to predict. I mean, I've been the rabbi of a synagogue for 24 years, and I don't see any organized religion in my synagogue. The opposite, I think some of the best religious communities are extremely chaotic and disorganized, and yet we are part of one of those major world religions. So I think, again, I'm resisting a little bit some of the very hard definitions. And
Okay,
I think
I'm going to make it hard for you.
Okay, keep
because
going.
this is where it could be argued that it really goes off the rails.
Yeah.
Because people will take those labels and they will use those labels for their own ends. They will
Right.
equate Islam with terrorism. They will equate
Correct.
Christianity with another ideology, and it's
Correct.
all well and good to nuance, but when you get so lost in the details and when you get so granular about religion, do you risk just ceding ground to, if you will, extremists of all ilks.
Right. Well, see, I'm used to being part of a minority, a tiny minority. I mean, Jews are 0.01% of the world population. I'm a lesbian. That's a small minority. I'm used to being part, in terms of my personal identities, of but still I believe deeply in the truths of some of those traditions I have. And I want to be part of a Judaism, for instance. I don't want to lose my ancestral religion just because a lot of Jews are homophobic or Islamophobic or racist. I want to actually reclaim my Jewish identity and say, I reject those forces which have taken in my name and in my Judaism, do and say things that I think are absolutely anathema to what my values are as a Jew. And so I'd rather personally stay within my tradition and fight the forces of evil that are threatening to destroy what I believe are the best of my tradition. And I think, to say one other thing about this, I think we're in a very interesting moment in time. In the 1950s, there was a very famous book published about American religion, Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, by Will Herberg. That was the only concept of what religion in America existed of, were those three categories. And of course, we know now that those are so deficient in beginning to understand religious identity. But I would even go further and agree with the Imam that diversity of religious and spiritual expression are now so at the core of who we are as Americans that we are actually the majority, not the right-wing religious voices, although they have great power. And I would say, instead of those silos of Will Herberg, we're now in a situation where the lines are horizontal. So as a progressive Jew, I have much more in common with progressive Muslims and progressive Methodists and progressive Hindus than I do with right-wing Jews at this moment in history. And that it's no longer a vertical category of identity, I think, but there are some horizontals. And that we have to understand that those of us who are committed to using religion and being connected to God in a way that brings out a certain force in the universe have more in common with each other than we don't. However, you are correct that there are very powerful forces who are using religion, and they have tremendous resources at their disposal which vastly outdo many of us. But it doesn't make them right.
Okay, so let me throw this question to you then, Professor Soret, because you're going to give us the lay of the land here. So, as Rabbi Kleinbaum just said, she is a progressive. She identifies more with progressives of other major world religions than she would of extremists within her own religion or right-wing extremists. But let me ask you then, so given, however, that more extreme views do tend to be more organized, in terms of getting their voice out there and their message out there and hijacking the public debate and the public spaces where those debates take place, what role, if any, should religion be playing right now in U.S. government and also in public education institutions?
Right. Well, that's an excellent question. I think in some ways your pushback against us offering overly complicated answers is the reminder of the liberal arts landscape in the need to intervene and not just offer a progressive counter to the conservative domination, but to complicate the lay of the land and call attention to the complexity across traditions and within. So to your earlier point about millennials and this ongoing reinvoked narrative of decline, what was really being talked about in that narrative is the decline of a liberal Protestant Christianity. Right? And if we're talking about the 1960s and the culmination of these narratives of secularization, while they've since been proven false, there was anxiety about the decline of the mainline and the rise of other religious traditions. And it's also that moment when the religious right pivots, right, in response whether to debates around sexuality or around race. And so it calls attention to the way in which religion alongside race, alongside sexuality, is always tied to the ways in which we think about those things. So I think there is a need for a liberal arts education, for scholars, but also religious leaders, to participate in the conversation and call attention to the difference within their traditions, and to make a claim against what is taken to be the normative position of Christianity or the assumption that all religion conflates with a conservative politics.
But where are those voices? I mean, because they're being drowned out. They're being drowned out by the more extremist voices out there of all the major world religions right now. I mean, it's the fringe is the voice that is heard the loudest, and you progressives are trying to push back, but I ask you, as a panel of progressives, why are you mounting such a rubbish defense?
Well,
So-
I think this is not so much, I mean, I think there are compelling takes for a progressive religious vision on the ground in cities, on campuses everywhere. I think this is a question of what fits in, and I think in some ways we could ask, right, where is the sort of the media's role in helping to shape the conversation that gives equal play to a competing range of religious positions that don't necessarily need to be convoluted. So if we measure religious vibrance through what's in a soundbite, or if we measure what's going on the streets of Harlem or in Midtown or at a synagogue, right, there are compelling takes. They just might not get the same sort of hearing. In fact, I was downtown on the Lower East Side for a colleague of mine who's a black queer Christian and is working with Mic.com, a media voice for millennials, and he was launching this new series of web debates. Darnell Moore, many of you may know him, and it's called The Movement, right? And it's a whole host of stories from across the country of folks who are organizing. Some of them are religious, some of them are spiritual, however they might want to identify. We can think of the secular lobby asserting itself as a religion, right? That raises these definitional questions. So there is movements all around, but are taking shape all around at the local level, but they don't always get a hearing in the way in which the debate is shaped.
Okay, so I've worked a lot in mainstream media, so let's just tackle like the big question out there, which is the rising tide of Islamophobia right now. And I will put this first to you, Imam Latif. How much, I mean, clearly every night you turn on, you can go through all the cable channels, and you will always find somebody equating Islam with terrorism, okay? And even if there are progressive voices there pushing back in their own little way, some media news organizations definitely steer toward that. There's clearly bias in a lot of news organizations, but do you think that that bias is intentional, or do you think that this is a legacy of really an anti-Arab, anti-Muslim stance that the media that has dominated the debate in this country since the 1970s, which is, if you go back then, that has been the debate. Arabs have been seen as terrorists, Muslims by extension. People think all Arabs are Muslims. As a Christian Arab, I can tell you that not all Arabs are Muslim, but that's definitely how it's been equated. So is this just flat out racism by the media, or is this mostly ignorance?
I would definitely say it's not mostly ignorance. And I would agree with the idea that a lot of the stereotypes that you have around being Arab and Arab culture, Islam, Muslims, are things that take place and manifest well before 9/11. I think what we've seen, though, in the last, not even decade, but even more recently, is a recognition of where certain power dynamics lie and how there can be a manipulation of narrative to advance one's own agendas with a recognition that is going to go unchecked. And I think the word that you utilized is very important because I believe a lot of it does stem from racism. We have a very deeply embedded and entrenched sense of racism that is in this country. It might not be a majority of individuals who buy into it, but numbers in and of itself, wealth in and of itself, connections in and of itself are not equated to power on their own, and we really need to look at how power in and of itself and clout in and of itself functions, and in what ways those influence these kinds of things. I've been interviewed by Katie Couric a bunch of times. I've been on the Stephen Colbert Report, covering Newsweek magazine. I'm not saying that to say, look at the places that I've been. The majority of media engagements that I engage in usually end when they're not live with the producer saying to me, I really wish that this makes it to TV, but there's a good chance that it's not because it's not the story that we're going to tell. And they're not looking to tell that narrative right now, right? There's a different value in being able to deepen the antagonistic narrative that says we should be away from each other and separate from each other. I can tell you in the work that I do, I've met tons of people who are actually doing meaningful work across cultures, across religions, and their stories aren't being told because they don't fit into a broader strategy that really allows for a select few to capitalize on our segmentation.
And what about you, Rabbi Kleinbaum?
I totally agree. I think it happens. Look, we know that fear sells products, it sells political agendas, it sells. All you have to do is watch some of the, TV shows or movies. The accents went from Russian accents during the Cold War of the evil monster that we had to fear to Arabic accents. You know, it's almost, you know, there was a shift at a certain moment, and they became, and it sells, it sells. Fear sells, anxiety sells, and when people are afraid, you know, other agendas are obviously can be, look what happened. We know that there were agendas to eliminate civil liberties in this country, and the use of fear to make sure that there was not a balanced approach, but rather a terrified population would agree to almost anything. And a right-wing agenda about civil liberties and privacy was very almost was enacted with this tremendous flaming of these fears, and exactly by not allowing there to be a much more complex presentation of voices.
Can I ask you, and I'd like to ask all the panelists this, were you at all surprised when Trump came out and made the suggestion that all Muslims be banned from entering? I mean, that was...
Not
that
at
was,
all.
that-
I
that-
wasn't
you-
surprised. I'm not
that
surprised
doesn't
by
surprise you.
anything he does. That he gets the attention he does, you know, is...
Were you surprised that he got some support on Capitol Hill? Were you surprised?
Not at all. I mean, not at all. People are looking to have these positions which are dramatic, and there's a reinforcement. It's like Pavlovian dog reinforcement. Look at the media attention he got by doing it. Others look at it and say, I can get it too. It's where we rewarded him in a certain way as a country, and he didn't get any, there was no downside to it for him.
But surely when you have calls like that, as you said, and you've all said it, that fear is what sells,
Yeah.
fear is what hijacks the
Yeah.
agenda. So it does beg the question, just mixing religion and politics. I mean, let's take a look at what they've done in France. In France, they have banned any religious symbols by, being worn by public workers or in public schools. So no crucifixes, no headscarves, no nothing. Now, this was controversial when they first started enacting these laws in the early 2000s, but the French came out and said, we are a secular society. These are our values. We will reinforce them. No religion shall have the upper hand. So my question is, was that an expression of democracy, or is that subverting democracy? I'll give it to you first, Professor Soret.
Well, I mean, I think democracy is sort of about a robust debate around a community of folks who don't all agree. And I think there's no option where religion is removed from the equation. And if we look back across history, religion has always been on multiple sides of any given issue. So we can think about the abolitionist movement. There are evangelical Christians there before there's a 1960s religious right. If we think about suffrage, if we think about the civil rights, I mean, there's always a progressive and a conservative if you want to fit them into those boxes. That so religion is on multiple sides, not helping, but participating and contributing to democratic debates in ways that we find to be helpful or unhelpful, agreeable or disagreeable. It's not a simple either or a possibility of removing it.
But is religious discourse in politics today doing more harm than good to democracy?
Again,
Today.
I don't know that we can say either or. And I think part of it is the way in which the debate, through an appeal to separation of church and state, was to privilege a particular way of bringing one's religious views on to bear into the public square. And there's a way in which we can account for that notion of pluralism that, in fact, privileges a liberal, in a sort of democratic sense, and Christian way of weighing in on the debate that doesn't give equal footing to other religious traditions who may have something equally important, significant to inform our public conversation that is a reflection of their beliefs or practices.
How about atheists?
I mean, this is an excellent study over the last 30, 40 years of the emergence of a secularist lobby. And they identify as humanists, as secularists, as atheists. There's no single sort of secular position. Some want to make a claim, right, that to be secular is a form of religion, and others want to refuse a set of debates that requires you to make a claim that you're religious to even be heard. So that again, there's no sort of, we could think of it as harmful or not, or giving space to a particular group of folks who were not recognized in the debate before. But even those folks who want to be recognized are fighting over the terms under which they can participate.
So let me ask you, Imam Latif, because when we take a look again, that it's definitely the more extreme and fringe voices which seem to capture, as you said, most of the media attention. But we've also seen a very interesting situation develop in Europe. For those of you who don't know, Europe is suffering from various serious cleavages right now. Fringe political parties have been gaining a lot of ground. A lot of right-wing political parties have been gaining ground. And a lot of those right-wing political parties love Vladimir Putin. And the reason, and this is, this is in Europe, and one of the reasons they really love Vladimir Putin is because Vladimir Putin flaunts his Orthodox Christian credentials. And so members of the fringe in Europe see him as a powerful figure on the world stage who's not afraid to own his Christianity, whereas in Europe, really it became unfashionable, almost politically correct, politically incorrect to in any way display your religious devotion. So it's now if you're religious, hey, guess what? You've got Vladimir. So you've got Putin on your side. So with that said, is it more dangerous to cut religion out of politics? Will that always give rise to demagogues to then seize upon religion for their own means and get that very powerful megaphone?
I mean, I think the difficulty in cutting or trying to cut religion out of politics is that you're going to always have a citizenry that is going to adhere to religion and spirituality in some way. And so it's not even just about how your religion informs you, but how your perspective of other religions informs the way you engage policy and build institutions, right? I work for the NYPD as a Muslim chaplain, and we can talk about what that means in terms of separation in church and state, and me being hired as a chaplain to work in a governmental apparatus. But I say it more so from the standpoint of it's one of the things that I do aside from my work at New York University. I've traveled on behalf of the State Department, met with the heads of Homeland Security, engaged senior White House officials in meetings behind closed doors. I still get detained coming off of airplanes for 4 to 6 hours at a time, even if I'm traveling in an official capacity on behalf of the State Department. The FBI has visited me in my home on multiple occasions. When I've asked them why, they say, you seem too good to be true. We're waiting for you to do something, so just know we're watching you. And I think anecdotally, to give you an indication of what this means in terms of policy, in my capacity as a police chaplain, one of the things that we do is we go to the Ground Zero site every year on September 11th. We have breakfast at police headquarters. We go down to the memorial with family members who lost loved ones on that day, and we participate in the ceremony. On the 9th anniversary of the attacks, Vice President Biden was there. And the ceremony was structured different in that the current memorial was still being constructed, so it was more closed off. So you had a stage where the ceremony took place. In front of that, a VIP area for city officials, family members who lost loved ones, and others. Behind us, there was a press pit, and behind that, an area for the public to come. So I'm in my police uniform. I'm an inspector by rank, which is a very high rank. It's one rank below a one-star chief. It's like a lieutenant colonel in the Army or something. And while I'm in my uniform, I still have my beard, I'm wearing my skull cap, we're talking, mingling until the ceremony starts. 3 men approach me in suits, and they say, Secret Service has spotted you from the top of a building, and they want us to check your credentials just in case. And I said, just in case what? And they said, we're sorry that we're doing this to you. I said, then why are you doing it? And to understand what they're really questioning at that moment is not just my presence there, but the validity of all my emotion tied to that space. I was an undergrad at New York University on September 11th in 2001. I stood in the middle of our campus in Washington Square Park with about 10,000 of my classmates as we watched the second plane fly into the towers, to deal with a lot of backlash and a lot of issues in the aftermath of it, people trying to push me down staircases, other people visiting us, identifying fully as just law enforcement, microphones from media all over the world in our faces as students wanting to know what do young Muslims actually think about what's going on. I stood at a lot of funerals for people of my faith and other walks of life who died on that day. So much of the work that I do today is informed by the atrocities of that day. And here those men are questioning the validity of all of it. And the frustrating thing isn't that I'm going through it. The frustrating thing is, what can I really do about it? to end this story in a place where I'm not trying to necessarily bring it to, but there is a woman who is standing next to me who is Latina, who lost her son on September 11th, and she said to those men, where no one else was saying anything, that what you're doing right now is more dishonoring to the memory of our loved one that we lost on that day than anything else. That here this young man is standing with us in our moment of need, and you're making it seem as if he's doing something wrong just because he's Muslim. So what I would illustrate from that is a bunch of things, but in the frame of this conversation, somebody is sitting somewhere at a table creating a policy that trickles down to these guys that says when you see someone who looks like this, you need to take another look at them. And that's where the challenge comes in. And I would say it's hard to divorce religion then from democracy, from politics, because beyond the rhetoric that we see on television, where people are just feeding into fears and ignorances of the masses, you then have institutionalized mechanisms that begin to infringe on the day-to-day living and just civil liberties of people who are just trying to live their lives. And you don't think about that in the framework of someone who's obnoxious like me, or who does what I do for a living, but a 70-year-old grandmother who can't speak English properly. You know, I go in that detaining room, there's a lot of diversity in it. You're talking about people from everywhere. I've seen women who are 7.5 months pregnant sitting in there, they're getting railed into, and their husband and children are waiting in the baggage claim in tears, not knowing what's happening to their parents. And I think that's why to give the facade or semblance of, well, out of our own dignity and superiority, we're removing religion from it, when in fact all you're really doing is taking away from people what it is that they should be entitled to practice in any democracy.
So do you see the French law then as infringing on the civil liberties of Muslim students and Christian students and Jewish students who can't wear religious symbols to their schools?
Yeah, you know, I've traveled a lot through Europe, both on behalf of our country and in my own personal capacity, and what I would call the French law is just old school racism. You know, it's this mindset that says that you don't like the way we do it here, go somewhere else. But where am I going to really be able to go? And your exertion of power in that frame is one where you are saying with a sense of entitlement that there is not going to be any recourse towards you. And until voices like that woman, who understand both in that moment her power and privilege, that she is the only one who is uniquely poised to say something, right? Because I can't say anything to them, but who's going to say anything to a 9/11 family member at the Ground Zero site?
But how do you get to the point of, because clearly, as you've said, until you come up with a better formula or better sound bites, you know, the progressive, thoughtful point of view is not going to be heard over the more fringe point of view. And it should also be pointed out that in France, one of the reasons that they initiated, you know, the ban, and it was largely targeting headscarves, a lot of commentators at the time thought that, was because girls who were not wearing headscarves were being harassed. Were being harassed for being immodest. So there was a situation happening in some schools where girls who were not covering their head were seen as sexually promiscuous because they were opting not to. So it was really to imbue the secular value of, guess what, women can choose to do what they want with their heads. It's not a commentary on that. And in this society, women have equal rights and they are not objects. And it was the way that the French authorities felt that they could best promote democratic values, promote, if you will, tolerance and equality towards women, which is a value that they hold very dearly. So again, it begs the question, when we have all of this religious rhetoric in our public life, does it not inevitably get hijacked and abused? And wouldn't it be better to take it out of public life, let people practice their religion as they see fit, and then we might get a more tolerant form of democracy? You're looking at me, so I'll let you take it first.
Well, I think it illustrates a key point, because what's being interjected is the voice that actually is able to interject its voice. Like when I've been in Europe, you know, and I'm not saying that there aren't young women who don't wear headscarves who've been harassed, right? Muslims are jerks just like everybody else. But to understand that...
Quite seriously harassed. Let's molested.
Do you know what I'm saying? Right?
Yeah.
And it's terrible.
I've been molested for not wearing a headscarf in many parts of the world. It's not fun.
And I think, and I'm sorry that that's happened to you.
No, don't apologize. Hey, you know.
But when I've been in
Comes with the
Europe as
territory.
well, because it can't be either or, right? We can't be selective in just telling certain parts of stories. I've been in schools in France, in Denmark, in Holland, where we've done tours of actual schools that end at the entranceway, that the principal is leading the tours, and he shows us a box at the end, and he says, this is the box where young women who wear headscarves are made to take their scarves off because it doesn't fit into our society. And literally women who have graduated from schools like this, who are traveling with me and are wearing headscarves, are saying back and forth, you know, what are you talking about? And their response is, it's just backwards. And we're trying to get them to not be backwards. We want them to be integrated into society and to really fit in. And when they opt to wear something like this, they're holding themselves back. We're just trying to help them, right? And that goes back to, I think, the notion of what to me is old school racism. Because you get somebody who is so into their perspective that they can literally tell an Ivy League graduate from here, standing in front of them, if you don't like it, you don't need to be here. But the way we see it, you dress like this, indicates that you don't get it the way we get it. You know, and I think the way that we sometimes choose to only tell certain parts of narratives, that we share only certain perspectives that have nothing to do with the masses but the advancement of our own agendas, becomes a disservice to the masses that we are supposed to serve when we're in these roles. The highlighting of a fringe voice in the Muslim community in and of itself impacts and devastates many Muslims' lives, but also does a huge disservice to the masses of people who buy into the fact that that is somehow the normative understanding of Islam, when that is the farthest thing from anything Islam buys into. And giving then that much more credence to an extremist voice on the right wing consistently also then takes away from so much opportunity for real communal growth and societal growth in our country, because we're choosing to elevate select voices that then say this is what the norm is when it's not.
But how is elevating, and let me give it to you, Rabbi Kleinbaum, I mean, is it fair to say that elevating secularism above religion is to elevate a particular religion, or is that just elevating secularist values?
Well, I don't think you can remove religion from the other very powerful forces in society so simply and to say,
But does it have to be such a part of public life? Do we have to be one nation under God? Do we have to swear upon a Bible when we go to give testimony? I mean, this is a very religious country. It's everywhere. It's everywhere in public life, and it's also in public schools. Is it not better for American democracy to elevate secularism, and in doing so, create the space for the thoughtful debate and otherwise, and prevent fringe voices from hijacking the debate?
well, I do believe that Jeffersonian separation of church and state and the wall that separates church and state, Jefferson actually didn't mean it to mean that religion wouldn't have an influence in the world, but that the state couldn't establish a single religious practice or a single religion. But I do believe, therefore, that the state doesn't have the right, and there shouldn't be any state-sponsored religion in the public sphere. That's complicated when you're asking about the influence of the religion in the public sphere, which I think religious voices should be there like all other voices. But do I agree with you that God should be taken out of the Pledge of Allegiance? Do I think the Bible should not be what people swear on? Yes, I don't think though. Let me say that in the correct negative. I think that it's a mistake that there are those mixtures. I do agree with you on that. I think God should be out of the Pledge of Allegiance. I don't think people should swear on the Bible, and we do have those options not to, but I think it shouldn't be. And frankly, another example, as a rabbi, I am an agent of the state that I can sign a legal wedding, a civil wedding. I don't think rabbis or imams or ministers should do that either. I think there should be a civil marriage that's done by the state, and a religious marriage for those who want to do that as well. So in that way, I do think there should be a legal separation. I, however, agree with the imam that the voices of religion are going to remain very important. The problem is also the voice of money in this country, and we can't even talk about these issues without addressing the role of money. And frankly, I think today is the anniversary of the Supreme Court decision of Citizens United, which has done more to destroy a very broken system in our country of electoral politics than even religion has done, which is to allow this completely unfettered, completely unlimited amount of money to pour into the political process. So it's a little hard to just separate the two. But I do agree, I would argue with you, and this is, I think, what makes religion strong in America is when the state is not engaged in it.
Okay, so let me ask you, Professor Sorit, do you think, I mean, are we in a hyper-religious cycle? Because there are so many forces agitating to have religion play a greater role in government. They do have such a power, fringe elements do have such a powerful megaphone right now. I mean, there are very deep cleavages in American society, and it's proved very, very fertile ground for extremist views that hijack religion as one of their vehicles to give them across.
Yeah, I mean, religion as either the problem or the solution to democracy, or democracy as the solution to religious problems is, I mean, I think they're entangled in ways that don't neatly get pulled apart over the course of history. And so, I mean, we could think of, I mean, although it's impossible to imagine sort of the emergence of American democracy without Christianity, it's not Christianity that makes democracy into an imperial force or into the requirement for slavery to build American democracy, right? So we could look at the way in which Christianity justified that, or we can look at secular arguments or economic arguments for slavery. So religion becomes one force in making a claim for the emergence of an American democratic nation, right? That's the irony, that this great experiment in American democracy is built on enslaved bodies, on unfreedom, which is not simply a product of religion building democracy. But we can also look at, and I think one of the things I've been fortunate to participate is that there are religious communities that do great work within themselves as sort of building spaces of democratic debate. I mean, this is sort of one of the histories of black churches, although not the most popular one in these recent polarized debates, is as a space for cultivating democratic citizens. Now, those democratic citizens also have short sights that mirror the larger society, but there are religious communities that abide debate and difference in a way that the public square still has not quite figured out how to do in recent times.
Well, actually, it's interesting because there are studies that show that religion can actually undermine democratic values by promoting one belief system above all others, but membership in religious institutions tends to promote civic mindedness, civic participation. People are more likely to vote. So it really can be 6 and 2 3s at the end of it. So because we're about to throw it open to student questions, I'm going to give you guys one last chance to finish the sentence, because you've now had some time to think of it. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation.
I'm going to leave it as it is because there's no escaping that force of history. Under God, with or without our allegiance to that God or gods.
Rabbi Kleinbaum?
I would remove God from any public pledge in the United States.
Imam Latif?
I don't know.
Like, I'm not touching that one. Okay, so let's throw open the floor now to some of you extremely bright, curious, and inquisitive members of the Columbia University community. We're going to hear 3 questions, and then I will take the questions and I will address them to the members of the panel. So please say your name, and if you want to say which year you're in or what your major is or any other identifying remarks, let us know, and then your question, please. Go ahead.
So my name is Angela Afa. I'm a doctoral student in social work here at Columbia. And my question is about the professor at Wheaton College who stood up in terms of in support for Islam by wearing the hijab there and the flack that she got within the school. So I just wanted to get your perspectives on how sometimes academia and religion maybe are at odds with each other and what your thoughts are about that.
And the next question, please.
I'm an alum from the Human Rights Program. I just wanted to comment and ask a question about what was insinuated earlier about equating conservative and extremism. I find it problematic to equate being religiously conservative with being extremist. So in this kind of institution, we have the luxury of having the discussion among like-minded thinkers, but how do we in the progressive community make room for religiously conservative believers? So how do we engage with and include them as we move forward in awakening our democracy?
Hi, I'm Max Feist. I'm a junior from Columbia College and an American Studies major. Well, and as the moderator, you've really been raising the very good point, which is that, a lot of people in the media have been using this very extremist religious stance. But there's a course I took last semester called Religion in America 1, and that course really hammered home to me that there's a huge diversity of ways that you can be religious. And as clear as that danger is, I would really like the moderators to talk about that there is, because of the prevalence of that doesn't necessarily mean that the only way to be religious is religious extremism. And to talk about the ways that, just as a philosophy or as a moral code, religion can have an impact on our democracy.
Okay, so let's start with the first question. Let's see, Professor Soret, let's talk about religion in academia.
So, I think it's important to say that we're not talking about a Columbia or a Vassar or sort of liberal arts education or Research One University. We're talking about an evangelical Christian college, which is out of a particular strand of Christianity that tends to subscribe to an exclusivist take on Christianity as the way. Right? Not as one way. There are other, if we're to enroll at Union Theological Seminary, there's a more open understanding of the relationship between Christianity and other traditions. My own background as attending a Christian college, even more conservative than Wheaton, would say, and I think this is the practice at Wheaton, in addition to subscribing to a politics of religious freedom associated with the United States, students, faculty, staff sign at a place like Wheaton an honor code, an agreement that may say everything is, I agree to this exclusivist take on Christianity. That's not the wording it may say, but it will say something along those lines. 2, I will not drink or I will not have sex, and that, hetero or homosocial, right? This is just sex, period, right? So, or there's particular gender hierarchy. And so, yes, we can recognize an effort at solidarity within a professor, faculty, person at Wheaton who wants to make a Christian stance against Islamophobia. That is a direct critique and out of line with the honor code that everyone that's a part of that community has agreed to sign. So it's,
to clarify, I think her issue, not her, the questioner, the professor at Wheaton had made the claim that the Muslims and Christians worship the same God.
Yes.
And it wasn't because she was wearing a headscarf.
No, absolutely.
As the question framed it.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're right, and that is the sort of exclusivist theological take. Certainly there are Christians, and there's a whole language around the Abrahamic faith. Go back to Herberger and the Protestant Catholic Jew, and the idea that Christianity and Judaism and Islam share a heritage, but not all Christians subscribe or would agree or concede the point that it is the same God. And I think that when we think about evangelicalism in the context of a place like Wheaton, there is an orthodoxy of that exclusivist take about the relationship to the Christian scripture and as Jesus being the only way.
Okay, moving on to the second question, which was about conservative religion being equated with extremism. There are various degrees of conservatism, and probably the far, 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 far end of the spectrum is where the fringe exists. But she was asking, how do we include the conservative voices in, if I understand correctly, in the more thoughtful discussion with the progressives? Like, how do we make that discussion happen?
I'm engaged all the time with voices of conservative religious voices within my tradition who I would not label extremist. That's not difficult for...
But do you ever have do you sit down at the table with extremists there and try to include them in the debate? Do you ever have extremists there at the table with you? Or do you guys ever face off against, sort of what I would call extremists in the media of any religion?
Well, I've done a lot of work within Judaism, and in the 24 years I've been the rabbi at CBST here in New York City, I've engaged with many different Jewish voices that I would label as extremist, absolutely. But I'm not sure that what the questioner was asking was whether we would therefore label all conservatives extremist. I wouldn't. So I would say both. I think there are many conservative voices and I'm speaking from within my own tradition of Judaism, which is where I feel like I have any legitimacy. So I think there are many degrees of voices of conservatism within Judaism, and there are some who are extremists, but not all of the conservative voices are extremists by any means. And I do think there's lots and lots of room for discussion and debate. There are some extremists that no, there would be absolutely no conditions under which I would even be able to engage in a conversation within my own faith tradition. And that wouldn't be only my choice.
Well, isn't that, if I could bring Imam Latif in here, because I do a lot, I've reported extensively from the Middle East, and I still do a lot of reporting. And one thing that, an idea that has really come to the fore, especially from Tunisia, in case you guys didn't know, the Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize this year, and that's because you had a moderate Islamist government that was elected, and then when things started to go wobbly and off the rails, they willingly gave up power to hold new elections. And basically, Rashid Ghannouchi said that Washington needs to understand that the only answer to ISIS and ISIS recruitment and the appeal of ISIS is to start supporting moderate Islamic voices. But do you think that basically, first of all, do you see any sort of shades of gray, will you, in an understanding of moderate versus extremist Islamic voices? And how would you describe the spectrum of conservative versus progressive Islam? And how can we sort of move that debate forward or move that idea forward that maybe moderate Islam is, and supporting moderate Islam could be the way forward to countering ISIL?
You know, the challenge that I have with a lot of these qualifiers is that they're not, at least in the Muslim community, boxes that Muslims themselves are necessarily putting themselves into, but they're boxes that have been imposed upon us. My moderation is still, in a certain way, elevating and empowering what is qualified as an extremist voice, because it's only moderation in reference to that extremist voice. And I think that's problematic. I've actually never been called a progressive Muslim in my life before this panel. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but because I'm pretty much called everything by everyone that you can think of.
Well, what would you call yourself?
I don't know. I'm pretty confused at this point. But to really think about that, you know, to me, Islam as a tradition is not one that really looks at a quantified approach, but a qualified. So it's not about how much you do, but how you do what you do. And individuals have their own personal trajectory in relationship with God. There's a lot of emphasis on battling the ego and cultivating a relationship with your heart and self-recognition to understand who God is. You could say that's moderation. I could just say that that's what Islam is. It's not the narrative that's out there because, again, we're not telling our story, and it's not because we're not. You know, last time I was on with Katie Couric, Fran Townsend was on with me. She was a former security advisor to Bush. And we were talking about things post one of the recent attacks. And while we're speaking, she turns to me and says, but you have to admit that, you know, Muslims aren't doing their part in speaking out against this violence. And that's privilege, right? It like reeks of privilege. It's like saying, well, if black people really wanted to change their situation, they would just work harder. There's Muslims all over the world who are actually speaking out against these things. Their stories aren't being told. The reality is there is an extreme element that's there that manipulates text, but within that ideology, the disbeliever that you can kill is me as much as it is somebody who's not Muslim. And that's just fact. ISIS kills more Muslims than they kill anybody else. And the sheer fact that I'm sitting on this stage, that I live in this country, and I'm not living here to either kill somebody or proselytize, makes my blood something that they can, you know, shed at whatever juncture. And if you listen to their propaganda videos, they say themselves there are very few Muslims in the world because they don't believe the 1.5 billion people who practice in Islam in large part actually represent the faith. The challenge that comes on now is that when you have an extremist voice on the right, and that's why conversations like this are important, so long as this moment informs other moments, and we recognize that our understanding and engagement of diverse societies can no longer be shaped by extremist voices in any way, whether that's extreme voices like ISIS, extreme voices on the Republican right that are bombarding us with an imagery that doesn't serve anyone's interest other than their own self-interest. And the gains that they get are not gains that are shared by the collective. but really things that, again, are just advancing individual needs. The point of the power of wealth and the influence of money and wealth here is very critical. And the country that, and I think what's relevant to this conversation, and shouldn't be divorced of it, is the conversations we're having around race and ethnicity right now in the United States. Islam, I would say, is not even looked at from a theological standpoint, a dogmatic standpoint, but is more so racialized as a faith to the extent that you have people who are Hindu, Sikh, atheist, agnostic, they just have brown skin, who are literally getting beat and shot every day because people think they look Muslim. And that stems from this extreme ideology that exists, I would say, on the right and is embedded in certain parts of our country. Would I have a problem sitting down with people who disagree with me? No, not necessarily. And I think that's also an important thing to understand. I know I'm talking a lot, but I'll end on this, is because we don't want to then get into the area of identifying, like a good, bad framework, right? Like, here's a good Muslim, here's a bad Muslim. And we now dictate that from the outside in, and we start to then delegitimize and say you're extremist because of your political viewpoints, because of grievances that you have, because you don't agree with security policy, domestic, foreign policy, whatever, right? I mean, keep in mind, right? I'm a police officer in a police uniform, and I get profiled. The FBI visits me in my house. If I speak against it, am I un-American? Am I extremist? If I say that that's somehow not honoring what our country is built upon, am I in a place where I don't really understand certain narratives and I don't belong here? But that's what a lot of people would actually say. And they would say that, well, you're just like them. You see what I mean? And I think that's where it's important to actually engage within as well as externally to start to break down some of these ideas and notions that we have.
I mean, really what you're talking about, it all boils down to power and control and privilege. And it's very interesting to frame the third question that we got in that context. When you're talking about, it's not just being a member of an organized religion. There are so many ways to engage in your spirituality. So is that the answer? Is it to promote spirituality over any particular organized religion? Who wants to take that one?
I could say, I think that is often how spirituality is construed, as if it is an escape hatch from all that is bad in religion. And I think the short answer to that is no.
I would disagree with you.
And that's why we have a debate, right? And I think that, there's a long history to spirituality being in its own location within historical forces attached to power. So to call oneself spiritual is itself a power move to say that, I have beliefs, and this is not, right, it can be a meaningful way of identifying oneself in the same way that religion is, right? So if we want to draw a quantitative difference between a progressive spiritual person or a progressive Christian person or a progressive Muslim person, I don't even know what we're talking about at that point. But I think we can recognize the
It's one of spirituality versus organized religion, because Pew research has also shown that, Muslims are the most distrusted organized religion, but there's a category that's distrusted even more, and that's people who follow no religion are distrusted even more in this society. So is the answer to stop extremist views from hijacking the debate to shift the power dynamic back in favor of people being able to exercise their religion free of discrimination? Is it to promote spirituality in the way that our founding fathers saw it, that one religion does not dominate another, one worldview of people's faith and values does not dominate another? It is about spirituality, and it is a private thing. These were, however, our founding fathers were of the Enlightenment, after all.
Right. I don't think that spirituality would be fair to be an anachronism for us to put what we currently think of as spirituality onto the founding fathers, although we can think of free thought and Enlightenment philosophy.
That way.
And I guess my short answer would be, I think no, right? That spirituality is not an escape hatch from, while also recognizing that it is a meaningful category for, especially within this generation, even though the term has a long history, for folks to articulate their meaning, the belief, the values they have in a way that also recognizes and resonates with a deep anti-institutionalism, right? So I've had a good privilege of being a part of a conversation at Union with a group of millennial activists who identify as spiritual and other. But there are folks within religious traditions who also identify as spiritual. And spirituality has, for some, provided a way to think about their relationship between their beliefs and their commitments that is not taken or conflated with Jerry Falwell or whoever we stand in for the radical right, in recognizing that that is not how they understand themselves as a person of faith or a person of belief, or as a religious person.
Okay, so let's get the next round of questions up to the microphone, please. We have 3 more.
So my name is Evan Goldstein. I'm a master's student at Union. And I hope this question isn't like totally grad student-y. But there seems to be a sort of underlying anxiety or presupposition in this panel that there is this thing that's called religion that is a good thing, but if it's not properly bounded by something we would call the secular, then it has a potential to become violent. And so I'm curious about how this sort of framing might be complicated by the arguments of folks like William Kavanaugh or Talal Assad, who would say that...
Now it's grad student-y.
Yeah.
Yay! Oh, no.
But who would say that not only is that not necessarily sort of historically the case, but that actually the opposite might be true, that this invention of what we call the secular as a sort of way of organizing bodies in space and time, right? My religion can't punish my body in the same way that the state can. And so actually the state is the sort of inherently violent apparatus which then projects onto certain forms of life this thing that it constructs called religion, which is then invested with a sense of violence. And so then I think Kavanaugh, this is going to be grad to me, the term is the myth of the soteriology of the state as peacemaker. So then the state, which is actually the violent sort of organ, is projected as the peacemaker, while religion, which is sort of just whatever forms of life are constructed as religion, is thought to be violent. So I'm curious about how this might complicate, and maybe not just complicate the terms of discussion in a kind of pedantic sense, but actually if we're trying to think how do we sort of live together in a productive way, actually be a better way of getting to that question than the sort of presupposition that seems to be operating here.
Okay, next question, please.
Hi, I was Harpreet Singh Wahan, EMPA candidate, and I thank you all for coming here and thank you for getting this dialogue going. In my view, I just want to infuse the perspective and just to propagate this one, that this spirituality is a graduation of a religion. Spirituality shouldn't be considered as that a separate religion, but it's, for every religion, spirituality is infused in it. A person who is not religious until he is spiritual. If I am a Sikh, for me, celebrating Eid or celebrating Christmas or celebrating Diwali, Holi, or any other festival doesn't make me any less a Sikh. My interfaith commingling between everyone is my propagation of religion. My identification doesn't get lost when I commingle with others. What I just want to infuse in my student community also is stay religious, whichever religion you are in, stay spiritual, whichever way you want in. Ensure that you live in a world of live and let live, and practice and let practice. Whichever religion or whichever denomination under we identify ourselves today or tomorrow be, that's immaterial. Thank you.
Hi, excuse me. I'm Josh. I'm a business school student, and I'd just like to hear your take on how do you balance the idea of inclusiveness and being inclusive with the idea of telling some people with deeply religious and deeply held beliefs that they're wrong and that they need to completely denounce their deeply held beliefs. How do you balance that? Thanks.
Okay, so let's let's.
Could we take
I'm sorry.
one more, since that one of those wasn't really a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Thanks. Great. Hi. Thank you so much for being here. It's really great to see this happening on campus. My name is Annika. I'm a graduate student at SIPA. My question is kind of twofold. One is, or the first part is that we seem to take it for granted that the media feeds off of fear. So for you, Patricia, thank you so much. But why do we take this for granted? Is there anything that we can do about that? I mean, we can look at the attacks on our Muslim brothers and sisters after San Bernardino and after Paris. The attacks on them went up threefold. So do we have to take it for granted from the media? Is there any way to engage with that agenda? And then also from the community members, what do we do from the academic perspective when our peers are being attacked? And then also from the religious perspective, how do you interact with different people, and what should the community response really be? Thanks.
Okay. Since we're running short of time, I'm going to give you each a question, and if you can just give me, so the first question, it sounded pretty much like, how do we get to a more constructive framework of inquiry? So why don't you take that one? You're the professor.
Sure. I mean, I think the short answer these are debates that I would spend the bulk of my time talking about when I'm in my theory and method class with new PhD students, which is to say, yes, I didn't read my colleagues on the panel as working from the presupposition that there is something called religion and it's necessarily good and we're about promoting it. But we can recognize the construction of the category of religion, like race, like gender, like sexuality, as part of this modern discourse that gives us something that's easily identifiable and has since been mapped onto, but emerges out of a Christian history, is now mapped onto, say, Islam and Judaism and all these other religions, right, that previously didn't identify as such. So yes, that's there is that fraught history of the category of religion that has shaped the way in which we think about it. And I think if all of us were privileged to have a PhD education, maybe, but then we'd probably mess it up in different ways.
Okay. How about Rabbi Kleinbaum? Let's take that second question, which was, how do you balance the idea of inclusiveness?
That's a great question, and I'll give you just a very brief example from my own experience as a queer rabbi of the queer synagogue here in New York City. I have said repeatedly to my colleagues in the Jewish community, I completely support their right, for instance, not to do a wedding between a same-sex couple, or not to have forms for their religious school that indicates that parents might be two moms instead of a mom and a dad. Within their religious community, I support their right to have those positions. I don't support their right to codify those religious positions into American law. And that's where I make a distinction. And I've argued with them, and I said I will defend, and I have defended very publicly their right to do those marriages within their synagogues. They don't have the right to determine what civil marriage in America should look like. It would be as if, for instance, the Catholic Church, which inside of the church does not marry a divorced couple, can you imagine the Catholic Church having the power over civil law in this country that an American could not marry somebody who's been divorced or is a divorcee? I mean, none of our politicians would be able to get married. So, of course, that intrusion of religion would never be allowed. But yet, the debate about same-sex marriage happened for all those years on the exact same language of religion. But at the same time, and I'll say this over and over again, I support their right not to do it. Nobody has to violate their own religious beliefs within their religious communities. And I do think that's a distinction between saying what those religious communities can then codify into civil law.
And Imam Latif, do you want to take the third question, which is, do we have to take it for granted that the media is just going to be promoting fear and have these certain biases and just keep chugging along with giving the most outrageous, most extreme voice the megaphone?
I don't think so. I think with the advent of social media, nothing is ever absolutely good or bad. And I think some of the positives that come from social media is that it creates an opportunity for other stories and narratives to come out, images, videos, voices that we're not necessarily privy to. If you're not getting what you need from CNN or from Fox or from whoever, don't let that be kind of an ends, but dig deeper and allow for yourself to be satiated by going and hearing other perspectives. And I think building off of that, if you allow for a media imagery to dictate how you engage one another, forget about anybody else, I would argue that you're going to be the one who misses out the most. While you're at a university, you have unique opportunity coming from very different parts of the world, different parts of the country, to engage people who are not like you. They don't come from your communities, they're not of your skin color, they're not of your social class, they're not of your professional ambitions. And this is a key moment to be able to engage people who are different. I teach a course in our School of Public Policy called Multi-Faith Leadership in the 21st Century. We started the first minor in multi-faith and spiritual leadership in the country at NYU, and I co-teach the class with the rabbi at the university. And the first module of the class we do is just on personal narrative and storytelling. We get kids from all over the university who take this class. It gets filled up. I think everybody thinks they're going to get an easy A. Very likely they will. But, they say for the first time in their entire educational career, not just in college, but high school, middle school, elementary school, they're actually sitting down and talking to people who are different from them, learning stories and narratives of others that challenge them to really deal with their own, not even microaggressions, but racisms. Like, they're shocked at what they hear from their peers, and then they also find value and validation in seeing the impact that their own stories can have on others, and recognizing that they actually have an ability to make a difference. And I would say to you that, real coexistence is not, hey, we got on a panel, we sat together for an hour, and then we went back into our bubbles. But when you go into your homes and the people who are eating dinner with you don't look like you, they're of a different skin color, a different race, a different ethnicity, country of origin, cultural heritage, religious persuasion, or maybe no adherence to religion, spirituality whatsoever. When you start going to people's weddings and life events and funerals and celebrations, then you're going to see that you actually have a depth to your bond, and then it'll be probably that much harder for you to stereotype others, which is something else that comes out of the Pew Research, that when we tend to stereotype and have these perspectives of the other, it's usually coming from us actually not engaging anybody from those populations or demographics, but merely having, beyond acquaintanceship or interaction, but real depth, right? Real experience with those who are different, becomes a key catalyst in breaking down the stereotypes that we have of others. Or you could just learn about the person who's sitting 5 rows in front of you and what their entire community is by watching like a 2-minute segment of some guy who doesn't even care about you, but he cares about ratings, and he cares about how many newspapers are going to be sold, and he's answering to a bigger corporation that needs to be able to cater to certain realities just so they can maintain their own positions in their own businesses.
And I just want to add, as a member of the media, I'll tell you, because I'm also an economist, that basically it all boils down to economic insecurity. I mean, as long as people see profit in promoting fear, and as long as there are journalists who fear for their job unless they promote a certain line, being promoted by the corporation that owns their news organization or the government that owns their news organization, there are fearless journalists out there, believe me. They go out there and many of them die for the story. They are there. But it is largely economic insecurity that is at the root of a lot of this racism that we're talking about. People who are disenfranchised, who need someone else to blame, and the very powerful forces. So if you guys happen to know any rotten rich billionaires out there, ask them to start a nonprofit news organization, endow it, and put tenured journalists on staff, and then maybe that will become the standard bearer.
On that note, I'd like you all to join me in thanking very much our moderator and incredible panelists. Just 3 quick points before we close. First, I'm sure many of you, both in the audience today and on the live stream, have ideas, have thoughts, have reactions. We can share them out with the university community for you. Share them with us at just email universitylife@columbia.edu. We have the Ideas and Actions digital conversation space, and it is exactly for having conversation after this sort of panel today. Second, share the video of the event today. It will go out on University Life social media, and please share it around with others. Third, want to remind you or let you know that on February 16th, the next Awakening Our Democracy will be held up at the Medical Center and will focus on food, access to food, and food insecurity. So again, please, thank you all for being here, and thanks again to our wonderful conversationists today.